Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of the 3 webinars in the South African pandemics, past and present, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1990, and a lighted cast on COVID-19 series. Exactly 100 years ago, in the spring and autumn of 1918, a global influenza pandemic struck a world that was still engulfed by the First World War, also known as the Great War. It was the greatness of this war that completely dwarfed the impact of the influenza pandemic, which killed between 50 and 100 million people. While we have memorials and monuments to commemorate the war dead, those who died in the Spanish flu are only remembered in the private realm. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has led many historians, scientists, and scholars to revisit this global disaster of 1918-1919 to see what we can learn from it today. In South Africa itself, over 300,000 people lost their lives, 6% of the population. 60% of the country's population was laid low. Across the globe, it killed more people than the First World War. Today, we are privileged to have eminent medical historian Emeritus Professor Howard Phillips and writer Dr. Finuala Dowling introduce the speakers. Emeritus Professor Howard Phillips taught in the Departments of History and Public Health at UCT, where he pioneered the teaching of the history of health, disease, and medicine. He is the author of several books in these fields. Dr. Finuala Dowling is an award-winning poet and novelist. She is a senior lecturer in the Centre for Extramural Studies at the University of Cape Town, where she currently is running a diary writing course that invites participants to respond to plague texts from previous centuries. You are able to submit questions during the discussion by using the question and answer facility. As many questions as possible will be answered. I will now hand you over to Finuala Dowling.
Thanks, thanks, Midi. Thank you. We're here, Howard. We're having this conversation this afternoon because of the immense resonance of the book that Medi's just introduced. It's like looking into a distant mirror that just provides fascinating and moving moments of recognition for us today. I hope we'll have a cover of your book on the screen soon, with its rather grotesque skeletal figure warning us of the death rate and details of the website where it can be ordered. I really I was so moved by your book, Howard, and I think history should be like this. It should make us weep, and it should make us reflect on ourselves, and it should enable us to learn something. And certainly some of the verbatim transcriptions that you have in your book that you recorded in the 1970s and 80s with great foresight will stay with me forever. And I wondered if you could begin this afternoon by telling us how this book came to be, and is the record that you provide us with in this book in some sense unique in the world?
Hi, good afternoon, Finuala, and good afternoon to everyone who's attending this webinar. The book really goes back to a time when I was starting out on doctoral research in the 1970s. And the topic which I stumbled on was this great influenza pandemic, about which I knew nothing and about which the history books about South Africa and the rest of the world said precious little. It was also a time when collecting oral testimony, oral history was getting off the ground. And so with the use of a then state-of-the-art a cassette recorder, now more a museum piece, I set about collecting testimony from people who had lived through the flu, because I recognized that there were very few people who had been more than infants in 1918 who had not been touched by the flu in some way. So there was still a very large number of then quite elderly people who had memories of the flu. And so I began talking to people, and then one person suggested someone else, and a friend and a relation. And so a sort of cascade of people around the country that I began to talk to and began to gather their memories. In my own family, one of the things I did first of all was to ask my father, who'd been born in 1914, if he had any memories of the flu. He had one quite sharp memory. He was 4 years old, so not very much. He had a memory, he had, I think, 7 siblings, of all of the children being crammed into a large double bed. I think probably the worst thing that his parents could have done, but he had this memory of everyone being jammed into this double bed because of the flu. But to people who were older at the time and those to whom I spoke in the 1970s and 1980s, there were much more vivid accounts which they shared with me in graphic detail. And the book is a selection of these accounts. Some wrote to me letters, lengthy letters, others whom I interviewed. And the book has 127 of these testimonies from people high, wide and handsome across South Africa, geographically, racially, ethnically, gender-wise. It's a very wide array of testimony from people who had lived through this horrifying experience in their youth.
And Howard, these testimonies that you were able to transcribe, they really give us such an extraordinary picture of what Cape Town was like then, and just such memorable images come up. One of your respondents, Stan Stone, said that the streets were so deserted because of the plague that you could have shot a bullet down Lansdowne Road and you wouldn't have killed anybody. And there's another respondent you interviewed, John Granger from Elsie's River. And this is verbatim what he said to you. That Spanish flu took away plenty of people. We just took the dead away as they died. People died in their homes. The wife lay on her bed, her baby on her chest, but she was dead. They carried all the dead away. There was then a doctor, Abdurrahman was his name. He gave an instruction that all who died must first go into a big warehouse alongside Craig's Battery in Woodstock and must lie there for 3 days. Then they could remove them and bury them. A group of scollies, some of them died, and so they placed the coffin on the trolley and set off for Maitland Cemetery to bury them. At Coburg Road, the group with the body stopped, and it wasn't long before they heard bang, bang, bang from the coffin. Well, they got a fright, but those who were brave opened the coffin. Then the man in the coffin was alive. From that incident came the doctor's instruction. What I love about John Granger's account to you is that it's so vivid, and it's the same story. It keeps coming up of this body found alive. I think there's another one from a Mr. Kasisa. I wonder if you could tell us about Mr. Kasisa and just take us back to that fortnight in October 1918 when the plague struck. What did the city look like? What did it feel like then?
Finuala, there is a slide up at the moment. There are not many photographs of the epidemic in South Africa. If you go onto Google, you'll see lots of photographs, but overwhelmingly they're from the US. But this is one of the very rare photographs which I was able to find. It's in fact of an ambulance collecting a woman who'd collapsed in the street. You can just see them loading her into the back of the ambulance. It's actually Corporation Street. The walls at the back you see are in fact the walls of the City Hall, which was turned into a relief depot. It's this absolute paralysis of the city which we should bear in mind, in which just staying alive required immense effort because so many people were down with flu and unable to feed themselves, unable to find medicines. It was really a city under siege. As one of the people who experienced it said to me very starkly, it was a city of the dead. Well, here's an account from Mr. Kasisa. Mr. Kasisa lived in what was then called Little Sicily, below Somerset Road in Cape Town. He was 7 years old at the time, and this was his memory of this absolutely horrifying scene which he witnessed in Somerset Road. I'd go home, find there was no one at home, or that the door was locked or something like that, and I would run up to the corner of Alfred Street and Somerset Road, where I witnessed something which is very vivid in my mind still. The people all along the road were, to all appearances, I would have taken it, they were drunk. They were just dropping like ninepins. It must have been just a coincidence that I was there at that time when there was a Scotch cart, or they called it a Scotch cart or dray cart, with two men, and in it would be bodies. And they would say, "Here's another one," and they would pick it up and 1, 2, heave it onto the back of the Scotch cart. And at the time, they would stop for a drink, brandy, Picardy brandy. I remember that very well. My father used to get it. And they would have a swig. And suddenly one says, "Oi, there's someone there." And I think I might have shouted then, "Mister, mister, that man's calling for help." And I could see an arm in this pile of bodies on the back of the cart, trying to get itself out and pull itself out. And they put the corpse up against a wall and put a tag on him or something. I know they did something to his front. And that's all I remember, because then I was wrenched from the back. I forgot now who it was, and I got a terrible beating when I returned home. So we need to think of a city absolutely paralyzed, with quite literally people dropping dead in the streets, in this of the image which you can see now. And then let me follow that with another rare contemporary image of the queue around the city hall, desperately waiting, queuing, no social distance, queuing for soup, for food, for lemons, all in very short supply. And also the medical authorities came up with some mixture. They called it the pink mixture. Great big basins of it were mixed and made available. I don't think it did any good, except psychologically, here's something. So there you can actually see queues around the City Hall. It's still World War I, October 1918. On the left, you can see a man in uniform. And this was replicated time and time and time again throughout not just Cape Town, but throughout the whole of the country. Cape Town was badly hit, but not as badly as Kimberley. Kimberley was an absolute death trap.
So, Howard, that's the scene that people experienced in those 2 weeks of October. But how did the country get to that point? Your introduction sets out very succinctly the kind of perfect storm that allowed the Spanish flu to take hold in South Africa. I wonder if you could run through some of those factors for us that really made the flu take hold here, and perhaps point out some of the similarities with COVID-19, and perhaps also at the same time answer the question, why was it that South Africa was the 4th worst affected country in the world?
Okay, we want to stand back a little, Finuala. The Spanish flu was a pandemic, which means it was global, and there were 3 waves of the Spanish flu. The first wave barely touched South Africa. It just came in September 1918 through Durban and went up to the Witwatersrand. But this first wave was much more widespread in the northern hemisphere. It is thought, and I do underline, it is thought that it began in the Midwest of the United States in a military camp. And of course, USA was involved in World War I. And so when the flu broke out in March 1918 in a military camp in Kansas in the USA, it was very, very infectious, but not all that lethal. So it laid low a large number of people, but wasn't particularly deadly. Because America was involved in World War I, troops were on the move. And so the infection rapidly spread from one military camp to the next, and then onto the troop ships, taking American troops to fight in Europe. It then reached Europe, spread fairly widely in Europe, parts of Asia, a little part of North Africa, and reached also Spain. Spain was not at war. Spain was neutral in World War I, and consequently there was no press censorship in Spain. So whereas other countries suppressed knowledge of this epidemic breaking out, they didn't want their enemies to know that they were under duress. In Spain there was no such censorship, and as a result it was labelled quite inaccurately Spanish flu. So this was the first wave, and it was marched through till about July, August 1918, and then it seems to have rather disappeared. And people said, oh, well, it was a bad flu, lots of people were down, not too many deaths, the war is our #1 priority. But then the virus, the influenza virus, mutated, it changed, and somewhere in July, August, it took on a very, very deadly dimension. So no longer was it just infectious, it was also now killing people. And it was this second wave which was brought to South Africa by returning troops in September 1918. The 2 troop ships stopped off in Freetown in Sierra Leone, where the epidemic was raging, and very little control was placed on movement of people from the shore to the ships, and on the voyage from Freetown to Cape Town, some cases broke out. When the 2 ships arrived in Cape Town, military priorities said only those who are sick should be hospitalized, the rest should be put into a holding camp. If nothing happens there, then they can go home because they are to be demobilized. And that's exactly what happened. Most of those troops were demobilized and allowed to embark on trains. And this map shows us what happened as a result of that spread of the epidemic, because this is a map of the severity of the Spanish flu in South Africa. And what you can see, the darker shaded areas were the areas where the mortality was particularly high, more than 35 deaths per 1,000. And it really is very clear if you look at that map of areas where the mortality was highest, and you have a look at that map of the railway network, and you'll see that it's almost exactly where the railways ran, so the mortality was highest. From Cape Town up through the Karoo, up to that great big railway junction at De Aar, which was terribly bad, very, very badly hit, and then down into the Eastern Cape, particularly Transkei, Ciskei, up to Kimberley, and then to the what was then the Western Transvaal. But notice that what was then Natal and the Witwatersrand relatively lightly affected in terms of mortality, because they had had first wave right at the end of the first wave, and if you contracted first wave influenza, you probably had a degree of immunity against this deadly second wave coming up from the west. So South Africa really had, in a sense, the worst of all worlds. It had first exposure of most of the population was to the deadly second wave, rather than to the first wave, which gave a degree of immunity. Secondly, South Africa had a very large number of young, particularly young men on the move, soldiers, as I indicated, but also migrant workers, desperate to flee from the hellhole of Kimberley in particular, and carry the flu with them. And it's as a result of that that overwhelmingly the Ciskei and Transkei were very, very badly hit indeed. So it's a combination of factors which really made for that perfect storm that you talked about. I should just add that South Africa actually has a very long history of people on the move, whether they were sailors or soldiers or migrant workers or trekkers or truckers or returning exiles. South Africa is a particularly mobile society and has been for many centuries. And this, I think, given also that South Africa, for good or for ill, is on a major sea route to Asia from Europe, to Europe from Asia, this really produces a scenario almost, you might say, tailor-made for infectious diseases to spread. And to bring it up to the point that you raised at the end, Finuala, COVID-19 has been spread, as we think, brought to South Africa by South Africans returning by air from Europe, brought perhaps by tourists traveling on the move, and then spread within South Africa by people desperate to get away from infection, people perhaps to attend funerals. South Africa, one of the underlying themes of South African history ought to be mobility, physical mobility. It's a very, very high movement society.
Thanks. So it's very much about movement and travel, and that the sort of railway map of South Africa tells a whole story all on its own, and your book is wonderfully illustrated in that sense. One of the people you interviewed, I want to just get to a very specific example of the movement of a virus, taking one person as the carrier. One of the people you interviewed, Brown Muchi, he was a mine worker who traveled on the railway to get back home. And I mean, I did ask you in our preliminary discussions about, were there any testimonies that were particularly memorable for you? Because we are now looking back nearly 50 years for you. And you told me that Brown Muchi was particularly memorable in his testimony. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, I'll do better than that. I'll actually read an extract from his testimony. Brown Muchi was a migrant worker working on the diamond mines in Kimberley, and he was 23 at the time. And his contract happened to end at the point when Kimberley was overwhelmed by the Spanish flu at the beginning of October 1918. So because his contract ended, he left Kimberley, and when I interviewed him in 1980-81, he was an elderly man, and we sat on the floor of his house, and it was an experience well beyond that of someone conveying facts to me. Brown Muchi almost began like a griot to tell me the saga of this memory, this terrible memory which he has, and you'll hear in a moment why it was so terrible for him. So here's what he said in a way which is still, I can hear the voice. Unfortunately, Brown Muchi has long since died. I caught the 8 o'clock train to Mafeking. This is from Kimberley. On the journey, passengers were taken ill and some died. I got off with one of my friends at Jan Kempdorp, and we began to walk. We began to walk home, about 30 miles, I think. As we walked, I began to shiver, and soon I and my friend could only crawl, unable to carry our luggage anymore. I struggled on, crawling in this way. I fell to my knees. I crawled on my knees for the whole day. I reached my home at Driefontein on the 3rd of October, and I fell into a deep sleep. I only regained full consciousness on the 19th of October. During those 16 days, I was delirious, imagining that I saw my friends when in fact they'd already died. And then for him, the most moving, emotional admission: I brought the fever to Driefontein. Driefontein was his village, it's near Taung. Many people died because of that flu that I brought, and many houses were closed up for good. And there is literally first-hand testimony of a migrant worker going home and taking the flu with him. And that we must multiply time and time and time again to understand the way in which the Spanish flu was transmitted across the length and breadth of South Africa to even the most remote and distant parts.
It's such a moving memory he has, and it's amazing how many people were so forthcoming to you about an event that and a memory that must have been so painful to them. And I think I only really thought about that when I came across in your book a statement about one man who had refused or declined, should I say, to give his testimony because the memories were so painful. And that made me think that your research must have really made you reflect on the relationship between trauma and memory and history. Does trauma make it easier for people to remember? Does relying on people's memories make your history more difficult to write?
Certainly doesn't make it more difficult to write. It makes it infinitely more vivid, and it really adds whole dimensions which contemporary newspapers, contemporary reports, documents quite simply do not have, because these are the personal, often private memories of individuals who relived these horrific experiences. I can understand that in the immediate wake of the flu, they would not have talked about it. But it was very clear to me that they had never forgotten about it, because the way in which people opened up their memories to me overwhelmingly indicated that this was something that had lain, not repressed, but had lain dormant in their memories for decades. And many of them welcomed the opportunity to talk about this, which they had experienced but rarely talked about. One woman said to me, "I didn't talk about this because no one would have believed me. None of my children would have believed that such a terrible experience had been part and parcel of my youth." A very few people, rather like the man that you mentioned, said, "I don't want to talk about it." But the majority really poured the cathartic experience, that they wanted to relieve themselves of these terrible memories and wanted to share it. And here comes along a curious outsider who, in a sense, says, "Please, can you open the tap?" And as the book indicates, people opened the tap, shared with me these memories prolifically and abundantly. Let me give you just one sort of anecdote. It is not unreasonable to recognize that in this situation, old age homes are absolute reservoirs of memories. And so I went and visited a number of old age homes to speak to elderly people in the 1970s. And at one, the residents were so keen to share their memories with me that I was jammed in by, I don't know, 15 or 20 people with their chairs and their wheelchairs surrounding me. And each one was saying, "No, ask me, ask me." No, it wasn't like that. So I really had a sense that people felt that this was something they wanted to unburden themselves of, and readily they shared these memories. And I was hugely the beneficiary and able to draw on the richness of these memories to flesh out, literally flesh out the documentary and newspaper record of the time. There's another dimension which is worth flagging, Finuala. If you read the histories of South Africa, or of anywhere for that matter, written around this time, until about the 1980s, you'll barely find any mention whatsoever of the Spanish flu. Now that's astonishing. As Medea said in her intro, 50 to 100 million people died around the world in the space of 18 months. That's probably 3% of the world's population. And that's not recorded in history. Something is very, very odd. People have got these memories, but the records, the published accounts in histories barely refer to this. And I think perhaps there are some reasons which go quite deep. One is that for many historians, until the 1970s and 1980s, certainly in South Africa, history was about politics and about war and about diplomacy and maybe about economics. Social history, the history of ordinary people, was not something that historians dealt with. The second thing is that who did write about the history of medicine and disease? The only people who then, until then, wrote about it were largely retired doctors. And you only have to reflect for a moment to realize that the Spanish flu was an utter and complete defeat for medical science. It was not a heroic occasion at all. It was not about how we managed to keep the flu at bay and triumph. And so it was not a topic that doctors wrote about, by no means. And so you will not find memorials to people who had died in the flu. In South Africa, I think maybe there are 4 that I've been able to track down, fairly remote. Governments certainly did not want to remember in public memorials this huge catastrophe in which government had been so unable to deal with the disaster. And so consequently, at a national level, at a public level, the flu really was not referred to, not by historians, not by public figures. But what these memories make very clear is that at a private level, the memories remained very, very powerful and very strong indeed.
And staying on this subject of the unwritten history and the people who don't get written and there's whose stories don't get written into history, makes me think of the number of your respondents who mention pregnant women dying. And I wondered whether they mention that because it's memorable. It's memorable if you happen to have known a pregnant woman who died of the Spanish flu, or was that an actual documented fact that the Spanish flu was particularly destructive to pregnant women?
Yes, I mean, that's one of the occasions when the documentary record and the oral testimony coincide exactly. Pregnant women were particularly vulnerable, and consequently, amongst pregnant women, there was a high incidence of Spanish flu and also high mortality. I should add that very unusually, quite unusual for flu. Normally, with flu, the people who are most vulnerable and likely to die are those whose immune systems are either not well developed, like very young children, or those whose immune systems have begun to wane, like the elderly. That's the usual pattern of mortality with influenza. In 1918, the Spanish flu was completely different. The Spanish flu particularly killed young adults between the ages of, say, 18 and 40. And of course, pregnant women fitted into this category particularly. But even within this category of young adults, pregnant women, for physiological reasons, were particularly at risk. And consequently, the number of pregnant women who died was disproportionate. And of course, with them died their unborn children. There were also a very large number of stillborn children. The effect of the Spanish flu on the mother-to-be triggered stillborn children. And so consequently, the effect on not just pregnant mothers, but also on the next generation who were not born, either because their mothers had died while they were in utero or because they were stillborn. The effect on that generation is quite noticeable. One of the things which I did was to look at, you might think this is a bit odd, I looked at school admissions in 1925, and I found that the educational authorities in 1925 were saying, this is very strange. Admissions to what was then called sub-A, grade 1, admissions to sub-A in 1925 are down. That's very odd. And then then the penny dropped. The admissions in 1925 were of children born in 1919. And because the number of children born in 1919 had fallen through pregnant mums dying or stillbirth, consequently, the admission was in 1925 down. So here is an example where oral testimony coincided very, very clearly with contemporary medical reports, and that's what historians do, is to look to, in a sense, triangulate. We look for different sources on the same topic, and here the oral testimony and the written testimony were very much saying the same thing.
Just one last question from me, Howard. We've got loads of very interesting and intelligent questions in the Q&A I'd like to get to, but people today talk and try to imagine a post-COVID-19 world. What was the post-Spanish flu? Ed Raibici says, I must say it's the post-1918 flu. What was the post-1918 flu world like in South Africa? Were there changes brought about as a result of what authorities discovered? And perhaps most sad of all, was there a generation that grew up without parents?
Exactly on that point. If, as I said, the majority of those who died were young adults, that's of course young parents, which means that orphans were created in huge numbers in a very, very short space of time. In a sense, there's a kind of a parallel with HIV/AIDS, though HIV/AIDS creates orphans much more slowly. Here, orphans were created within a day, within 2 days. The Spanish flu was vicious, it was fierce, it killed within 3 days. And one of the most poignant illustrations which I've come across is this one. It says it all. This is the widow of a dominee. He was 39 years old, so exactly in that category. This is the widow with her 4 small children at the graveside of this dominee. And again, we can multiply this image across South Africa, across every component of South African population, hundreds of times. So I ask you, you look at those small children there, what life did they then lead without their father? What happened to them? What happened to those, my guess, and there are no hard figures, my guess is we're talking about 900,000 orphans created within the space of 6 weeks, less than 6 weeks, something of that sort. In oral terms, one of the equivalent, most poignant testimonies came from a man whom I interviewed in the 1980s. He was 90 years old, and he said to me this: I was 10 when my mother died in the Spanish flu in 1918. And then this 90-year-old said to me, and I have missed her ever since. So there is a man whose whole life had been under the cloud of the Spanish flu and the loss of his mother. Emotional, psychological, often financial. People losing a breadwinner. What happened to families who were shattered? What happened to orphans who were spread amongst family who went into orphanages? South Africa had a huge orphanage building program. But you asked also about other consequences. Another consequence was, of course, a very, very striking recognition, as epidemics do, of the deficiency of the existing public health system. In South Africa in 1918, there was no National Department of Public Health. There were 3 doctors in a sub-department in Pretoria, but no Department of National Health. So one of the immediate consequences, because every doctor at the time was saying, the Spanish flu is coming back, it's coming back, we need to act. Within the space of about 4 months, the 1919 Public Health Act was passed. That's record time for any legislation on health to go through. And that in 1919 set up South Africa's Public Health Department, and that's exactly the department which exists today. Its descendant is Zwelin Mkhize's department. The South African authorities also recognized that the flu, again, like all epidemics reveal inequities in society, imbalances in society, very starkly indeed, as COVID has done. It's revealed the real underbelly of South African society. That happened in 1918, and one of the recognitions was that housing was very, very poor indeed, particularly for working class and middle class, lower middle class. And so some initiatives were taken, not surprisingly given the political context. They tended to benefit white South Africans in the first instance, not exclusively, but to a large extent. The first Housing Act was passed in 1920. And so that's the first formal commitment by the South African state to provide funding for housing across the country. And some private initiatives also taken to provide housing, one of which was Pinelands. Pinelands created because of a wish for there to be housing in a well-ventilated area away from the urban slums. And so that was a private initiative. And if you go into Pinelands today, you'll see there's a little plaque, a memorial stone commemorating that origin. Not surprisingly, given the nature of South African political framework at the time, one of the responses of white government was to say Africans, high numbers of deaths in African locations, they must be pushed further and further away from white areas lest they infect white South Africans. And so consequently, in the wake of the Spanish flu, as indeed had already been the case in the wake of the bubonic plague in 1901, special locations were created further and further away from white suburbs, particularly for black South Africans. And the 1923, as it was called, the Natives Urban Areas Act, is exactly the framework for providing accommodation in South Africa. Langa is one of the consequences of that. I've spoken a great deal. Maybe those who have questions should have a chance.
Howard, yeah, I'm going to just cover some of the questions, bring them up, so they'll be a little bit jumbled because I haven't been able to organize them according to theme. Some of them are little questions and some are more complicated. And maybe we should start with what you've got on the screen there. Is that a memorial, or is that a that's Botha? There's a question about is that General Botha's grave?
No. That's a gravestone, a rather ornate gravestone in Cradock, and really just to indicate how families were shattered. Two brothers, both died on the 25th of October 1918 on the Spaanse griep of Spanish flu. So these are the two Botha brothers of Doornhoek Farm in the Cradock district. Yeah. No, the gravestones are really the only memorials other than, as I said, I think there are three which I found which are really remote and tucked away.
Because there's a question about where those memorials might be found. So you can't remember the name of any village.
Yes. The De Beers dynamite factory in Somerset West. I think 75 of the workers in the factory died. And in the little section alongside the dynamite factory, De Beers erected a memorial stone to the 75, I've forgotten the wording, don't think it says workers, the 75 something men, workers who died, probably employees, 75 employees who died in the epidemic. So that's one. It's a private initiative by De Beers. There is one in central Bloemfontein put up by an Afrikaans cultural organization to the members of that organization who died, and that lists probably about 25 names. And then in the grounds of the old Kimberley Hospital, there is a pavilion which was erected through public subscription to honor the nurses who had died in the Spanish flu, the nurses at Kimberley Hospital. Those are really, oh, sorry, there's one more. In the library in Port Elizabeth, the Port Elizabeth Municipal Library, there's a plaque up on the wall listing probably about 10 or 12 volunteers who had helped in the flu and who had succumbed and had died. Those are really, as you hear, I mean, they're not very, very high profile. They're tucked away. In a sense, they almost are touching on private memorials. There are no great big, huge monuments. They don't exist, not in South Africa, nor anywhere else.
Howard, I want to go back. There's a question asking for clarity about the 3 different waves of the flu. One of your questions says that you were clear about wave 1 and 2, but she didn't get wave 3. And maybe because we are so fascinated by waves of a pandemic, that a pandemic actually moves in waves, whether you could just give a little brief clarity about the 3 waves again.
Yeah. So the first wave, very infectious, but not all that lethal. Starts in Kansas in a military camp, crosses the US military camp to military camp, crosses the Atlantic to Europe, spreads through Europe, part of Asia, part of North Africa. That's the one which generated that misnomer Spanish flu. That more or less damps down and vanishes by July, August 1918. And then the virus mutates rapidly and takes on this deadly second wave dimension. And that's the one which hit South Africa so hard. In South Africa, it was known as Black October. That's the one which sweeps through South Africa, kills 300,000 people, and disappears, probably because quite simply it had burnt itself out. Today we'd say herd immunity had been acquired because it was so rapid and so swift. If you contracted it and survived, you had immunity. And as a consequence, when the 3rd wave hit South Africa in the middle of 1919, it wasn't all that serious, though there's one significant exception, which I'll tell you about in a moment. It wasn't all that serious because so many people still had temporary immunity. In the Northern Hemisphere, that 3rd wave was a little earlier, and those devotees of what was once almost obligatory viewing, Downton Abbey, will perhaps remember that early in 1919, several members of the household go down with Spanish flu. The one significant, really important death in the 3rd wave in 1919 in South Africa is, I think, notice I'm putting that carefully, I think none other than the Prime Minister, Louis Botha. Louis Botha went down to his farm in August 1918, and contemporary press reports say he contracted a chill and went back to Pretoria and died within 3 days. It's that within 3 days which for me is telling, because the flu was known as 3-dag siekte, the 3-day disease, the 3-day sickness. If you survived more than 3 days, then you would likely survive. And the press at the time didn't say it was Spanish flu. One of the people whom I interviewed, whose father was a senior civil servant in 1919, said to me, everyone knew it was Spanish flu, but they didn't want to say that it was, lest panic be let loose. So there's I would say, very strong circumstantial evidence that Louis Botha died in the 3rd wave of this 3rd wave. And in fact, Richard Steyn, in his recent biography of Louis Botha, says so. So there is a significant figure who died very possibly in 3rd wave Spanish flu. But that 3rd wave really wasn't all that severe in South Africa because so many people still had temporary immunity.
Mm. And there's a question, interesting question here about masks. The questioner says that pictures from overseas in the 1918 flu depict some people wearing masks. Do you know whether people in South Africa wore them?
None of the photographs of South Africa that I have looked at show anyone wearing a mask. Indeed, and I think this is telling, there is a photograph in the book of the then Governor General, who is, at least in theory, the most senior statesman in the country, visiting a relief depot, and he's not wearing a mask. And so I would deduce from that, if he's not wearing a mask and none of the other photographs show people wearing masks, that masking was not something which was common or indeed even likely in South Africa. It's very different to many of the photographs we're seeing in from the United States.
Howard, I just want to point out to you, you're not aware of the Q&A, but so many people are writing, and it's very moving for me because they're saying my grandmother died died in Bloemfontein. Was there a particular reason for a Bloemfontein death? And then, or my grandmother or grandfather worked in the medical services. Were they particularly badly affected, as we're finding with COVID now? Another similar question: where can I find more information? Is there a register somewhere of the dead? I know your book has got a photograph of I think it's a Kimberley Cemetery page. There must be others.
Yes, you need to go to the cemetery registers. There is no consolidated list, again, because the state did not take on the responsibility and did not wish, in a sense, to acknowledge that so many people had died and that the state's response had been so feeble. So there is no consolidated list. You need to go to individual archival depots to access cemetery registers. At the risk of giving an advert, that's the book where all of these memories are registered or reproduced, and that has got the one page from the Kimberley Register.
And that's also for those of you who've asked on the question column how to get hold of the book. That is the web page where you can go. There have been some questions about contemporary media coverage, Howard. In 1918 in the newspaper, I know that your cover picture is a cartoon. Is it from Die Burger of 1918?
That's DC Bunzeier's memorable, stark cartoon, 16th of October 1918.
So you obviously consulted newspapers, and I think that the question, I'm just trying to summarize this question, it goes something like this: Did the newspapers of the time report on the flu with specific attention to the fact that people's mobility was causing the spread of the disease?
They reported extensively, but I don't recall much that people were strongly urged to restrict their mobility. But again, here the oral testimony was quite telling, because it's very clear that a lot of people took upon themselves a decision to make sure that they kept themselves isolated and in quarantine. Indeed, one of the people whom I interviewed, I remember she said to me, we used to close all the blinds. My father said, close all the blinds, that will keep the germ out. There are also quite a number of, there's quite a lot of testimony from people who lived on farms who said, my father locked the gates of the farm, and in one case actually put an armed guard at the gate of the farm to keep people away. There are also accounts by people trying to provide relief, being told, don't come near our farm. Whatever you want to leave here, just leave and go away. So at an individual family level, yes, social distancing, but certainly nothing that I recall, which certainly nothing emanating from government of the sort of lockdown that we now are so familiar with.
Howard, there are a few questions about statistics. As you can imagine, how reliable the kind of death tolls are, and the variance in different people's estimations. And then there's a question specifically about South Africa's statistics. The questioner says that noting the state's actions with respect to housing and separating people along racial lines, how accurate are the number of deaths from the Spanish flu for South Africa? So you mentioned at the start that 6% of the population died. Could it in fact be a greater number? Were some people being ignored, buried privately?
No, this is a major headache. There's no way in which we're going to know a figure with any precision. But let me just sort of outline the way my thinking went. There was a formal commission of inquiry into what they called the influenza epidemic, and it asked magistrates around the country to submit reports of how many people had died in their magisterial district. And they then compiled this, and they came up with a figure of 142,000 deaths around the country. So that was the official figure, and that's the figure which for a very long time was quoted as the number who died in South Africa. When I began to go below the surface, below this published figure, to individual magistrates' records, I realized that magistrates often were just sucking a number out of their thumb. One in particular I recall, I think King Williamstown, the official figure in to the Commission of Inquiry was something of the order of 2,000. And one must always be very suspicious when the numbers are neat and end in 000. But I then found that in private, the magistrate was saying about 2 months later, well, that was just the figure I thought at the time. I think it's closer to 5,000. So, I mean, those official figures are clearly very, very suspect indeed. So I tried to get at it from a different direction. What I did was to look at the census, and the censuses indeed are also, one should not put too much store on them, but perhaps a little more. I looked at, there's a census in 1911, and then there's a census again in 1921. And what I did was to take the usual population growth percentage and project forward from 1911 and look at the 1921 figures. And the 1921 figures are of the order of 500,000 lower than the projection from 1911 would be.
Gosh.
It seemed to me that maybe that was a little of an overestimate. I spoke to demographers at some length, and some contemporary documents, particularly reports from Transkei, said we estimate that 100,000 people living in the Transkei and Ciskei have died. That was, in terms of region, worst hit. And so consequently, it seemed to me that perhaps 142,000 was clearly way too low. 500,000, 500,000, I thought was perhaps excessive. And so really, I went for a figure of 300 to 350,000, which the demographers to whom I spoke said, well, if you're going to make a call, that's somewhere in, it's the ballpark figure. So that's where the 6% comes from.
Wonderful. Howard, we're running out of time, and I'm going to give my thanks in the words of one of our audience members, Charles Slater, who says, thanks, Howard. Thank you for a fascinating talk, brilliant as always, and extra relevant in this COVID time. Time just flew by in this talk. So thank you very much for being so wonderful to interview. I'm going to hand over to Madi to say closing words.
Thank you, Finuala, and stay well.
Thank you for taking part in this rich and fascinating and also sobering webinar. The next one in the series will be at 3:30 next week, Wednesday at 15 July. In this webinar, Professor Howard Phillips will be in conversation with virologist Professor Ed Rybisky. The focus of the conversation will be on the virological aspects of the Spanish flu, and will look at whether the viral history of the Spanish flu can shed light on the current pandemic. We hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. Are we all there?
Hi.